in Scottish mythology, there are buildings and places that have a life of their own, really, and they attract people. So, were you attracted to this house in that sort of way? He says, yes, when I looked at it, I did. It pulled me in. And, I knew it was going to be a place worth putting time, effort. And, it had a future beyond being a farmhouse. And it certainly needed to be saved from being demolished.
Welcome to The Radical Land, a podcast series by the Stove Network in association with Community Land Scotland. In 2020, the Stove, along with Community Land Scotland, commissioned 4 artists to unearth the stories of radical land ownership in the country through a handful of residencies with community trusts from Edinburgh to the Hebrides. In this series, we will speak with some of the artists and community landowners involved in the project. Through a series of interviews and conversations, we explore the stories of community land ownership in Scotland and how this project unearthed new understandings of ownership, creativity and community in the process. In this final episode of our 3-part series, we speak with artist and filmmaker duo Colin, Tennant and Saskia Coulson. Throughout their project entitled Stories of Radical Landownership, the duo sought to co-create visual stories with the community landowners through a mixture of multimedia works, including photographs, audio recordings, and moving images. The pair wanted the communities to use the process as a way to reflect on their achievements, but also to consider the future challenges they might face. Working alongside Bridgend Farmhouse in Edinburgh, West Mull Iona Development, North Harris Trust and Isle of Eigg Heritage Trust, the final works are a series of photographs and a short film in Gaelic and English. The work represents a brief dive into the deep, rich world of community land ownership. The outputs are testimony to this moment in time and the ambition of community landowners during a very remarkable year. Okay, well, I'm joined by Colin and Saskia of CT Productions, who undertook the Stories of Radical Landownership Commission. How are you?
Very well, thanks.
Yeah, we're very well.
Good. I don't know why I'm kind of introduced. I'm acting like I did that for every single one, but I haven't. So I don't know why I'm starting to like that.
I thought it was your go-to script.
No. I'm just living out my sort of like Saturday night talk show host fantasy.
It sounded like you've been doing it a million times.
Yeah. Okay, so we'll kick off. How did you approach the commission? What did you do? What did you do?
That is a good one to start with. The way that we approached the commission was really to go and talk to people. That was the first stage. So we wanted to meet the 4 different projects or the 4 different organisations and just meet people that were connected to the organisations, and not just those that were on a sort of part of the board or an administration level, but people that were actually living in communities where there had been significant land ownership development. So we really just went and did that. And by doing that, we just set up meetings where we could have conversations. Sometimes we would record these conversations just for our own research purposes. But really, it was just about going, meeting people, asking questions and trying to understand how being connected to these community-led organisations was affecting their life. That was our initial process.
Yeah, and I think also in the initial stage when we were speaking to the different community trusts, they had specifically said, quite a few of them, about speaking to young people and trying to understand the young people's perspective, especially for those trusts that had maybe been established for quite some time. And so those young people had actually grown up on the trust and had not maybe experienced the process of actually gaining that or going through that community asset transfer. So trying to understand how they viewed land ownership from a perspective of having it just kind of always be there as a given, the community owned that land. So I think that was something that was a concept that came to us from our initial conversations with some of the key people that the Stove had put us in touch with about for the different estates.
Kate Lewis of North Harristra.
I really didn't know at all what to expect from Colin and Saskia. All I knew was that they were photographer filmmakers, and it's not something that I know anything about. And they said that they would be prepared to do a workshop with the children and give them a few tips on filmmaking themselves. And when they did that, they added a whole nother dimension to our John Muir Award, because after that, the children were looking at everything differently and they were listening to things differently as well. And, Colin and Saskia were very, very clever at giving us all very achievable things that we could start to do with our phones. And we all took little slices of video that we're really proud of and love. And then to see them all threaded together on the last day like that was inspiring. And it's something that we're going to carry on doing.
Brilliant. No, the generational stuff really kind of came through in our interviews as well, and how important that sort of, because it's particularly within a Breakin, there was the kind of story there was sort of, you saw this sort of, and it's an amazing place if you ever get to go. It's just like been built up through so many youth projects over the years that now, like, that first hut that was built, is now the kids that are playing in that, their parents are the ones that built it as part of the youth project. So there's that sort of, like, and I guess in your commission it was really exploring stories. So what was the sort of, how did you approach telling that story, or was it, are you still exploring that? I don't think there's one defined way of kind of doing that.
I think for us, storytelling is obviously a crucial part of our practice, and what's important to us is that we enable that storytelling rather than be the storytellers. So we were really keen that the voices of the community were at the forefront of the storytelling process, and we didn't want it to be an interpretation by us. We wanted to have an authenticity. So by having conversations and by really getting to know the people that were connected to the organizations was key. And first of all, learning about their personal stories, like individually and collectively, but also so that we had a grasp of their journey, basically, and that we could help tell those stories in an authentic way. So it was really difficult because this assignment or this commission happened during a global pandemic. So we weren't really able to physically connect with people in the way that we normally would do. We'd kind of hoped that we could work with some of the members of each community trust to do filmmaking workshops, to work with them in making our own short mini stories through short films. But in reality, we weren't really able to do that. I mean, for a few of the places, we couldn't actually physically be within sort of the same room as people inside for long periods. So we were meeting outside, or we were meeting in outdoor spaces, but we still had masks on. I mean, it was really problematic, to be honest. But what helped us in terms of trying to tease out those stories was the fact that most conversations we had, whether it was on Zoom or whether it was physical, we would record it. And that goes from the people that we met up in Harris to the people that we met in Edinburgh to the people we met in Mull and Iona. So by being able to record these conversations, we were able to document the individual stories, but also pull out themes and ideas that were connected across all the different organisations, and that really helped us when we came to develop the main film, to make the main film, which was the culmination of the project, really.
Yeah, I think when we could, because we obviously have this connection between our visual practice and storytelling, we did try to connect people's personal stories with a sense of place. So, for instance, with Bridgend, we'd ask people to tell us or show us a specific place at Bridgend and tell us a story about why it meant something to them. And then, for instance, with North Harris, we went on several hikes with some of the people who established the trust, and they showed us places like where they grew up and told us stories about their childhood in these places and why it meant something to them. And so through those encounters, we also tried to capture the visual elements as well as the stories, and to sort of try and make that connection. And I think that's maybe also where we were exploring something with our practice as well, because obviously with stories, it evokes memory, and memory is not always a clear and direct thing. So I think with a lot of our kind of overlay of visuals with the sort of audio pieces as well, it maybe is more akin to that sort of thinking of memory, because it's maybe not a kind of always a kind of
accurate document,
or just like an apparent connection between maybe what is being said and what is being looked at. You know, it's that kind of essence of maybe what kind of, when you're thinking about memories or when you're thinking about stories, things are sometimes not as straightforward as you might want them to be. They're maybe a little bit more abstract.
Speaking here is Callum Mackay of North Harris Trust, taken from Colin and Saskia's audio recordings of their time on the island.
My family roots are largely based in Scarp. That's where my family came from. Obviously, Scarp is fairly inaccessible, especially in the winter. It's a fairly short distance, but it can be very stormy in the winter. And in the days before telephone, if people came to the North Harris side of the Sound of Scarp and wanted it to be ferried across to Scarp, there was no telephone or other means of communication, so they used to come across from Scarp on the other side of the Sound, and there was a particular rock at which they stood, and they shouted across to the island that they were looking for transport to take them across to the island. And if the people on Scarp were prepared to come and get them, then they would do so. And they generally did, yeah. So that rock still stands there, yeah. In Gaelic it's called Clach na Hevach, which is the rock of the shouting. Yeah, yeah.
Something there about the memory and identity and place, but that storytelling sort of, it ties on almost with that sort of mythic element of communities and place, and the alignment of that around ownership, and the sort of, you know, how it translates down in generations from the memory to the sort of narrative that's told is it's folklore. It's yeah. You know, it's a new folklore, because a lot of these purchases are relatively recent. I don't know, actually. That would be good to know in my own research about when the oldest one is. Do you know?
It's Eigg, I think.
That's the Eigg.
In 1993 or 1994.
Yeah, but that's not a long time. This is a really new, and I think even Community Land Scotland is actually a relatively young organisation connecting this. So it's really interesting that we're coming out the other side and sort of, I don't know, reacquainting ourselves with those stories once again, or sort of in a sort of unconscious way. Yeah, but you spoke on the themes that you were sort of connecting, you know, almost unconsciously.
through each of those places. Can you speak on what the themes are or were?
Yeah, I think there's quite a few obvious themes. So ownership and empowerment were quite obvious themes that sort of came out through our conversations. But also I think there was this, we explored this notion of radical, and we were quite keen to try and understand what the word radical meant within the context of land ownership. So we would often pose that question to the people we were talking to. So we would essentially just say, what does radical land ownership mean to you? And most often than not, people would say, well, I don't really see what we are doing, what we have done in this organization and this trust as being radical. It seems normal to us to have ownership of our land, to be able to contribute to the way that we run the land, to be able to contribute to the way we deal with community assets like community halls and social housing. So I think there was that theme of radical and normal was also quite at the forefront of the work and what that meant. And then I think there's also the themes of collectiveness and individuality and community.
Yeah, and I think also time was a big element of it as well. The notion of past, present, and future. We were actually asking people to kind of think about the past and to tell us about the present of the trust that they were connected with, but also we many occasions asked them about the future and what their ambitions were, what for not only themselves but like the wider community, and that might not just be the community that's dealing with the trust, but also kind of maybe other people that are affected by it. Like for instance, with Southwest Mull Iona, they obviously, the SMID has a certain amount of assets, but people don't live on those assets. So it's like, how do those assets then benefit the wider community? And those are maybe not necessarily people that are actively involved in SMID, but it is the community of people that live there.
And also each individual organization or trust would have their own individual sort of, I guess, issues that they're tackling. So like SMID, as Saskia mentioned there, they were trying to address issues around employment on the island and keeping young people there, and also housing, and in particular, like first-time buyers being able to purchase houses and to try and sort of stop the
second home crisis.
Yeah, so basically there was lots of people buying holiday homes on the island, which meant that there was very few houses coming up in which young families or young people could purchase to get on the ladder, which meant young people were moving away from the island to seek employment, and there was kind of a vicious circle with it all. So,
and we met quite a lot of them actually, like a lot of people that were maybe at that kind of first time buyer stage that were really struggling to afford to buy a home. I think there was a few that were renting, and maybe some that were trying to basically segregate a bit of land off of their parents' croft area, but we're really struggling with that because of the whole legalities around kind of croft land is such a minefield as well. So there was lots of issues with the people that we were actually kind of speaking to.
So you had all these sort of individual themes that were connected to the individual trusts and organizations, but most often than not, they would feed into empowerment, and ownership, and being able to feel empowered to make these decisions to change the area in which you're living in. But it might be, obviously, in Bridgend in Edinburgh, they weren't dealing with housing and employment as such. It was more a social space for a community to gather in which they had control over the types of initiatives and projects that they ran out of there. They had art classes, they had music classes, they had workshops for growing fruit and veg, on how to cook. And a lot of that was kind of things that were servicing the local community, as opposed to trying to reshape how that local community was structured in terms of employment and housing and sort of larger issues like that.
And you could say that there's maybe a difference between the kind of urban aspect, but I'm not even quite sure if I would put it down to that, or if it was just the way that it would operate. Because you could see that model working in any one of the other kind of rural community trusts as well, and vice versa. So it's just the way that maybe those specific people kind of got together and decided to kind of, model their trust in that specific way.
Lynn from Bridgend Farmhouse.
Yeah, I'm Lynn, and I live very local, just up the road, and I've lived there for about 30 odd years, and there's never been anything in the community round about me. So when I retired and I had a lot of time on my hands, Bridgend Farmhouse was just about been handed to the community, so I got involved right there and then, and it was great. For the first time I'd had something in my local area that I felt I could engage with and come to, and it was great.
On Bridgend, it is a sort of on a thematic kind of, on a purpose driven one. It's probably the most abstract in the context of everyone else, because from my experience there, it was almost like they were almost kind of cultivating meaningful experiences for people as well.
Yeah.
That in the context of Edinburgh, which is so kind of, I mean, it's Edinburgh. It's
culturally diverse. Yeah.
Well, yeah, that's the brand, isn't it? It's the, and I suppose there's something to say for that, and it's such an odd place. It's like, actually like within the sort of urban landscape, that you're just like, I think there's like the shopping center is like 5 minutes down the road, and then you take a corner and you're suddenly in this like farmhouse, and you can see the castle in the distance, and it's just such a kind of bizarre place.
And the fact that it is a farmhouse, but it's an urban context, I mean, that sort of juxtaposition in itself is quite interesting. But I think for us, a lot of people kept asking us through the project, what did you see were the differences between the urban and the rural context? And it's maybe not so much about that. It's maybe just about the individual trusts, because I think, it's all of them could kind of stand with it as their own models. And I don't know if those contexts would really dictate certain elements of them or not, but.
Yeah, and it's also the focuses in terms of, as you touched on there with the SMID, that are be around employment being kind of the major hurdle they're facing, the major kind of challenge now. So they've acquired the land. Now they feel accountable to, wider, almost global economic, and it's scary. I think there's something quite. Whilst the empowerment is there, the accountability is raised, and accountability, I don't believe it's often used as a negative. It's like, you're accountable to this, therefore if something bad happens, you're the one that gets gets told off, or you're the one with the blame. But accountability in this context, I feel, is actually a more transformational experience, and that once you become accountable for the land, you are then responsible to that land, but as a collective you are. So it's really interesting.
It's an opportunity, isn't it, for them?
And I think the key concerns, I mean, you see employment there, and the housing crisis is particularly strong in Abriacan near Inverness. And when you mentioned, like, the young people starting kind of houses on their parents' land, the same thing's happening in Abriacan. That they've managed to do that. And in Lewis, it's actually population. They're struggling to kind of get the diversity of population that they require maintain that evolving culture of community.
And I think that's the same in Harris. They're trying to. I guess with the population, it's like again, it's like trying to hold on to the young people and the young families. And they're struggling with that as well. It's like, and most often than not, to be able to encourage young people and young families to live in these remote areas, you need things like employment and housing, and as well as amenities, and because these remote areas are naturally spectacular. They've got an attraction to them. But that being said, there isn't a huge amount of employment there. So, it's trying to find that balance. And that's the one thing I would say about the more kind of extreme rural areas. And by that, I mean like islands or rural areas they're very sort of remote. They do face quite different sort of different problems than maybe what more urban or initiatives and organizations face. And there's no kind of way of getting around that. I think that'll probably always be the case.
I think also during during the period of our project or our commission, there was a few newspaper articles that came out about how it's more and more difficult for local people to buy property, like across the Highlands of Scotland, just in general, and it's kind of down to people realizing that they don't have to live in cities now after the effects of kind of restrictions and COVID lockdowns. So, more and more people are relying on just kind of zooming into meetings and stuff. And I think a lot of people are looking to escape to the country, but actually that has a real impact. I mean, that's, that people say that's the dream, but that also does have a real impact on the people that actually live there, not being able to afford, and especially when people are coming up and kind of purchasing all the properties and hiking up prices, it gets even harder and harder for people to afford their first homes or any home in these areas. So they get kind of kicked out of their local community, which is sad.
It's also, there's sort of two cases for it as well, where there's an absenteeism or it's a second home where they're not contributing to the culture, not contributing to the life there. And that's part of the sort of, the global capitalistic kind of view of things is like, well, around ownership. But
I mean, we have that with the stove, don't we? That was an instigator for trying to essentially take over an empty building in Dumfries Town Centre, was because of absentee landlords and this sort of the effect it was having on our town centre, and the fact that it was falling into disrepair because absentee landlords weren't doing anything with the property that they had there, because most of them had a portfolio of property that spanned across the UK and Ireland. And I think that absentee element can have issues when you talk about second homes, or if you live in small rural communities and half the homes are holiday homes owned by other people that live elsewhere, then all of a sudden you're not getting that enriching community environment because there's not as many people there. And you're pricing out young people that want to stay there, and you're not having as many young children going to the primary schools, so the primary schools can't stay open, and it has a huge knock-on effect.
Yeah, I think there's something quite telling about the resonance across Scotland around this. D&G is almost in the earliest place with that, but I think what's going to happen over the next 5 years or 10 years, we're going to start potentially seeing what's happening in the Highlands happening here. But there's a sort of counter movement that we're ahead of. So it's not, whilst yes, there are various landowners throughout Galloway, we're at a stage now where it's embedding that kind of culture or that knowledge of ownership. And I'm grabbing onto ownership, and because there's a sort of literal understanding of ownership, this is mine, property, object, building. but I think there's actually more of a lived thing that people are starting to get reacquainted with, where it's sort of, because we've existed in sort of like a double speak, you know, a mistruth or post-truth sort of thing, where why shouldn't I have something to say about the place in which I live? You know, and if you compare it to Dumfries High Street, the work of Mid-Steeple Quarter now is to sort of not only own those buildings, but to get the point across and to re-establish the connection of our own connection to the land and our own connection to the places in which we live. And these examples across Scotland, whilst rural for them predominantly, provide the same basis or the same foundation that we can learn from. So I agree. You actually, just to kind of go back a wee bit on what you touched on in terms of what you asked people, and you asked everyone, what does radical land ownership mean? I'm going to throw it back to you. What does radical land ownership mean to both of you now?
If anyone should know, we should, right? Because we've been speaking about it so much. But I guess also the notion of land ownership, I suppose, if we're kind of going back to these ideas of the commons, which essentially this is what it's coming from, is it really that we need to feel to have that ownership of the land? I mean, I guess it's just, it reminds me sort of a lot of maybe tensions between, then this is going to be really far-fetched, but Native Americans with the colonialism, like the colonials, and coming over, and that debate between, you know, the Europeans coming over and claiming the land, and the sort of the folklore says that the Native Americans never believed that anyone actually owned the land, you know. And it's just, if we are returning to these concepts of shared shared, I don't know, sharing and shared, not burdens, but shared, what's it when you have to do something like chores or whatever, sharing the responsibilities. I mean, should we even be thinking about, is the land ours to own? I'm not quite sure. You know, I think it's just, I think there's a lot of tensions in all the words, isn't it? It's just
it's really interesting, because for me, the word that's been sticking out, and similar to you, and I have asked, you know, various different others about what radical means to them, and within that context, similar to how you've approached the commission and the conversations. But Saskia, what's really interesting there is, we've gone through that process, the word is sort of becoming more blurred and sort of insignificant in terms of the actual relationship. It's almost becomes, the further out you pull from, or the more objective, or the lens you start to kind of pull back, and what radical seems to be useful within that context, but the more you peer in, it doesn't exist. But actually, ownership, that word, that concept, actually does the same thing, because and that's really interesting, because the point of the community ownership is almost kind of, in a slightly abstract way, dispelling the idea of ownership in general, of you know, because it being community owned, it's invitational, you know. So it's yes, you're allowed to step in, yes, you're allowed to kind of roam, yes, you're allowed to kind of, there's no, you know, the fences are there to keep, you know, something else in or out. It's not to keep you out. It's and yeah, the likening that in terms of the actual Native American concept of ownership, or lack of concept for ownership, is quite resonant, in that we're almost returning back to that, or reacquainting ourselves again with.
Yeah. Well, I think we need to. I think that's the missing element of it, is that I think that we've kind of hit the nail on the head, in the sense that radical is not radical, and that we need to kind of return to these kind of traditional methods of practice. But I think along with that, we need to kind of understand that we don't own the land, we don't own earth. It's just something that we are we've been very graciously allowed to live upon, and we need to start treating it as such, and not feel like we have these sort of stakes and what can the land do for us. And it's how can we live in harmony with nature and with kind of
It's interesting because Richard Bracken, in his sort of practice, he comes from this place of actually the etymology of the word wild is willed. It's willed beasts.
Mm-hmm.
So he explores through his commission in a sort of larger way that idea of will, and that the land beyond ownership is living out its will, so that we we live with that will and we act within our will. But the concept of ownership within that sort of, again, is sort of blurred out if we remove it, if we allow ourselves to remove that idea. So maybe in, I don't know, 100 years time, a community land ownership won't necessarily, well, we hope, may not even be a concept. It might be something that's, we're dragging ourselves out of the sort of pit of capitalism and into something new, into some new kind of epoch or society.
Well, it's definitely, currently it's a canon for achieving a lot of things that I think a lot of these communities wouldn't have been able to achieve. That I think in a lot of instances, if you look at the likes of Eigg, there was a lot of issues around oppression from the laird who owned the land before they bought it out. So it is beneficial to talk about community land ownership, but I think that is that next step forward, is to not even thinking about it as ownership as well. I think and it's really interesting, Richard's practice and how that has kind of already begun to kind of break down those concepts, which is great.
I think also what you mentioned before, like this movement that's deemed community land ownership is been happening for a very short period of time, when you look over the history books. So we're still trying to work out kind of what that means. And the UK is quite far behind large parts of Europe in terms of that feudal state mentality, really. And we spoke to Cameron from West Mull Iona, the chair, I think, or he was the chair of the organisation, but he was in his late 20s living on the island, and we talked a lot about sort of housing and unemployment and issues that were specific to West Mull Iona. But he mentioned something that always stuck with me, and that was about how he felt that maybe community land ownership wasn't necessarily the best and the only way in which to have land ownership. It's not necessarily the best model, but it should be in the mix with all the other types of models, whether that be large estates that are owned privately, communities owning sections of the land, and also just maybe national trust and other kind of organizations that have been set up. So he sort of said that the fact that we're now in the conversation is a good thing, and it's perhaps best that we don't try and turn the whole country into a community land asset, but the fact that we learn from how these different organizations are working and how that can hopefully contribute to a more fairer society for everyone living in those areas.
Yeah.
No, it's really interesting in terms of that community land ownership. We sort of have this sort of narrow, I've had that held onto a narrow perspective of it being, it's the way forward, must be the only way forward, but actually it's the opportunities that sort of emerge from community land ownership. Now, you touched on employment, but I see in North Harris, for example, speaking with John the Ranger, now he did an engineering degree and was going, there were opportunities for me to work within weapons manufacturing.
Yeah.
That would have been extremely lucrative.
It's the reality of the situation. But I did engineering in university, and like I'm glad that I'm able to do a conservation kind of based job now and a natural environment based job now, rather than contributing. Exactly. Because I mean, what I would have done before is, yeah, I could have worked in renewable energy or something, but I could have also just as well gotten a job at BAE or Rolls-Royce and worked on weapons manufacture. And it's just, in this day and age, the realities of...
Given that I had this association or this opportunity within North Harris, my role is now conservation. So the opportunities and employability, it's just reversing the cycle of destruction and kind of, and that comes, it's particularly conservation, I believe, comes from these rural kind of ownership and owning the opportunities and creating the infrastructure in order for that to thrive.
Yeah, and it comes back to that empowerment as well, that theme of empowerment. However, there are private examples of empowerment. There's people that work within large conservation organisations that feel empowered in their jobs and that feel they have opportunities to sort of shape policies and change the way that we do things. And that happens within a private sphere as well as a sort of public or a third sector or a community run platform. So, like as I said, I think there needs to be a realization that there are different models in which we can run or contribute to society, and community land ownership is one element of that.
Yeah, great. I'll wrap up kind of just with a sort of lighter end. So what were actually some of your highlights throughout the whole process? I know you had a difficult time in terms of the actual pandemic and speaking with people and actually making those connections, but were there standout moments for you?
Loads of like special moments, like for example, some of the hikes that we went on in North Harris were really quite spectacular because we were walking with young people who were between the age of 12 and 16. And when you're out walking, some of the best that enables some of the best conversations, because you're just out walking and there's no real purpose to it other than enjoying the landscape that you're in. And obviously being in Harris, it's quite a spectacular landscape. But we had another member of the community trust there, Colin, who had lived in the island all his life, and he would probably be in his late 60s, I think. He was a retired school teacher. And he was telling us stories about the island of Scarp, where he grew up, and it's now an uninhabited island. I think the last people that lived there were in the 80s, I believe. So we're walking in this incredible landscape, and you've got someone that's lived in this area for, the best part of 70 years, telling you about what it's been like for those 70 years. And then you've got young people who you're having conversations with, and you're saying, well, what is it that you love about this place? And most often than not, it's that connection to the place, it's the connection to the landscape that really resonated with them. However, there's really quite contemporary things that come up in that as well. So it's like, well, we need decent broadband. We want to be able to play our Xbox online, but they also want new mountain bike tracks, and they want like things that are maybe more appealing to younger people. So I think that a real highlight for me was being able to walk in that landscape, to experience that place with different generations, from younger people to older people, and to see how the communities within that area had changed over time and what was relevant to young people now, and what their aspirations were for the future, as well as sort of someone who was telling us about the past and where he came from. So they were quite magical, those conversations and those walks, I would say.
I would say that for there was a few different things as well for me, but one of the things that stands out is the people that we spoke to at West Mull Iona, and I would say that was the most difficult for us in terms of the restrictions, because that was when we were heading towards the second wave
And we were coming from Glasgow and we were going to an island.
And they'd only just started to have their first couple cases. So they were quite concerned. And it was just a blanket kind of worry across everyone on the island. And at the same time, there was an actual storm. Did it even have a name? It was that bad. It was a horrible. It was nearly
Storm Jimmy.
It was like nearly a hurricane.
Hurricane Jimmy.
And so we were basically battling all of these restrictions and hurricane-like weather, and yet people were so dedicated to come and meet us, to speak to us. They would. Cameron, for instance, walked, I think, 2 miles there and back in the middle of this wind and rainstorm from his house, just so he could sit with us. And then halfway through our chat with him, we actually had to send him away because somebody else had come from 2 miles from their house and was standing outside in this storm. And it was just incredible that people were
very open,
but also just so willing to take time out of their day and to actually face this storm, or face the elements, in order to kind of share with us what this concept means to them and how important it is to them. And that was really humbling. And we met a lot of incredible people because they were just so willing to share their stories with us.
A short extract of Colin and Saskia's film, Stories of Radical Landownership.
How are we radical? This is what the normal should be. If this is not the normal, then it's radical. How are we different in our land ownership?
Pushing in an open-hearted, sincere and kind way for social change.
I think your film speaks for itself within all this work, and that's the point I think that most art should have. It's actually, and film lends itself much more easily than an abstract piece of art that hangs on a wallpaper. Hangs on a wall. So yeah, I think the role that you had in that is massive. I think in the conversations that we've had with North Harris and with Bridgend around the actual kind of interaction that you have had, it spoke to that process.
Good.
It really did. It didn't. There was no concept. You think filmmakers arriving and, oh God, the director, oh God, the cinematographer, oh God, it's an open process that you adopt, and you lend yourselves you work your process fits within these kind of contexts, basically, with communities and with kind of the openness. And I think the product or the output, whilst beautiful, speaks to that process as much as it's a beautiful piece of film. It's also, it would not have come from anywhere else had you not adopted and owned that process of telling the story and being open. It wasn't you're constructing the narrative and you're telling the story, it's allowing others into that.
The bairns 3 years grown new and thriving, they say, yet will not be complacent, there's more to this challenge.
This is A Radical Land. Thank you for listening. The Radical Land was produced by Martin O'Neill of the Stove Network, supported and in partnership with Community Land Scotland. To view Colin and Saskia's short film, please visit www.thestove.org.